Welcome to the Money Over 50 podcast, brought to you by Dallas Davison and Michael Hogue from Money Over 50 Financial Advisors. This information is general in nature and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. Therefore, you should consider whether the information is appropriate for you and your personal circumstances. If you require personal advice, please contact Money Over 50 Financial Advisors. Here are your hosts, Dallas Davison and Michael Hogue.
Welcome to Money Over 50. Today we've got a listener question. I'll read it out, Michael, and you can respond. So it's a message we got from Leonie. Thanks, Leonie. It says, "Hey guys, I'm loving listening to your podcast while I get out and walk each day during this lockdown in New South Wales. Its refreshingly Aussie tone makes you feel at home. In your podcast, there's a lot of emphasis on getting your super right, which is great, which is what I'm doing. My question is, what about other investments outside of your super? Are you going to be discussing those topics in your podcast?" Thanks, Leonie.
Thanks, Leonie. Thanks for the kind words. We're loving that you're loving.
Well, that's why I read the whole lot out. If she'd said, your podcast's a bit of a dud, I don't like listening to you idiots, sort of go, okay, let's just get to the question and strip out all the nice stuff.
No, all jokes aside, Leonie, thanks. We're really happy when we get listener feedback and people tell us that they're getting some enjoyment out of the podcast. So it's a good question as well. And it's one of those ones where sometimes we disregard. Well, not sometimes. A lot of the times we disregard what people are thinking, and disregard is the wrong word. We
don't know necessarily.
We don't know what people are thinking.
So I think the point that you're making here is often because we sort of speak the same language. So there's often things that we talk about and we know what the other one means, but the layperson in the street might not necessarily know what we mean or why we're, in this example, why we're not talking about investments outside of super. So I think the way that I thought about this question is there's sort of two parts to it. Is that I guess firstly, everything that we've talked about in terms of investments through super. So, we've talked a lot about owning the great companies in Australia and around the world, and the fact that you normally have to be invested in those companies in order to get the long-term return that you need to fund your retirement. We've talked about the trade-off of investing in these companies versus cash or investment properties or anything else like that. So the first thing I'd say there is all of those conversations and all of those discussions apply exactly the same when it comes to investments outside of superannuation. So that's I guess the first thing is we've talked about how that relates to superannuation. How it relates to investments outside of super is effectively exactly the same thing. And so there are some reasons why we primarily focus on investing inside super, and then there are some minor changes when it comes to investing outside of super. And so I thought we could go through today, Michael, just talk a bit about why do we use super and what are the differences when we're investing outside of super.
Yeah, absolutely. So why super to start with? Let's set the scene.
Yeah.
Each individual in Australia currently has a limit of $1.7 million that they can effectively turn into a tax-free superannuation fund.
Yeah.
Once they've retired. Now they have to meet certain criteria. They have to be aged over 60. They have to meet a condition of release.
Yeah.
I don't want this legislation to detract from the main benefit.
Yeah.
Is that if as an individual, I can have $1.7 million of my superannuation fund in a 0% taxed account-based pension. Once I've met those criteria, and I tell people, let's forget the word superannuation. Think of this as having a tax-free company. So whatever I'm invested into, the rate of return once I've hit that criteria, 0% tax. I take an income from that, which I live off, 0% tax on that. And not only that, it doesn't even show up as income anywhere. So I can have myself and my wife $3.4 million, $1.7 million each inside a superannuation fund that's paying 0% tax. We can draw an income from that. Let's assume from that, just to keep it nice and simple, from that from that $1.7 million each, we draw $100,000 of income each. We've got $200,000 of income.
Yep.
We're over 60.
Yep.
That shows up on my tax return as $0 of income. I get $200,000 of clean
Tax-free.
money.
Yep.
If I wanted to,
Yep.
I can go and earn $25,000.
Yep, as
almost
stacking
tax-free.
shelves at Woolies and pay no tax on that. Yeah, so basically, if you then go and work part-time, that doesn't get added in there. It's not on top of the 100 that you've drawn out of your pension account. It's just completely tax-free. So that's the end game. Yeah.
Now, the way that it's designed in Australia, depending on how much income I earn, I'm actually going to get a tax deduction on the way in as well.
Yeah.
So, we can now put in $27,500 per year per individual.
Yeah.
And that can go in as what they call a concessional contribution, which we claim as a tax deduction. And we've spoken at length about that as salary sacrifice or a personal contribution that we're claiming a tax deduction for. Again, don't let the legislation detract from the true benefit.
Yes.
It includes what my employer puts in. Now, my employer puts in $10,000 a year, let's say. It's nice and simple now. It's 10% super guarantee rate.
Yeah.
So someone on $100,000 a year, their employer pays in $10,000 as a super guarantee contribution. What that means is that person can actually put in another $17,500 and
so
claim that as a tax deduction. So basically here we're arbitraging for a lot of people. So the average tax rate in Australia is 34.5%. So anyone that earns between, is it 45,000 and 120,000, I think it is on a 34.5% tax rate. So I put that $17,500 into superannuation, and I pay 15% tax on the way in, but I claim that at a 34.5% tax deduction rate. So effectively, I'm paying only 15% tax on that contribution, but I'm claiming a 34.5% tax rebate effectively on that money. So I'm getting a tax deduction on the way in, and it's going into a situation where it's ultimately going to be completely tax-free once I've retired on the way out. So I guess that's why superannuation, we're so gung-ho on superannuation. I can own the similar or identical investments that I own in my super fund. I can own that outside of my own name. It's just that it's a different tax situation.
So I guess that's the point that you're getting at there, Michael, around there's sort of two separate questions, which is what assets do I own in retirement and what ownership structure do I own them through? So you say to think of it as a tax-free company. I say think of it as a circle. Just draw a circle on a piece of paper. That circle is your it's your superannuation fund until you're retired, and then once you retire, up to $1.7 million each. That circle, all of the assets that you've accumulated inside that super fund, that circle, can be moved into a pension account. As you say, at that point in time, no tax to pay on the earnings on that ever again. No tax to pay on any income you draw out of that. So, and you've touched on this before, where I think that because that's such a concessionally taxed environment, there'd probably be a greater uptake if you had to pay more tax on the way in, because people would then appreciate the tax saving of that. If you go, right, well, when I get to retirement, I get to be in this tax-free vehicle, this circle, this entity that I've accumulated all these assets in. I never pay tax again. That's fantastic. If someone said, okay, but you've got to pay a bit more tax along the way in order to access that, we'd probably kind of understand a bit better, because you'd go, I've got to give something up to get that benefit. But this is sort of, there's no, not only is there no cost to use that entity, there's tax savings along the way as well. So there's generally, you touched on, your concessional contributions into super. There's different ways to minimise capital gains tax on getting money into super. So both in the last 10 years of your life and throughout your retirement, there are just so many different tax advantages available to you by using that ownership structure rather than by investing in your own name. So that's I think why, like we say, there's a separate question of what assets should I own, and what asset classes should I be exposed to, and all that sort of thing. But if you're just looking at as I get to 65, I've got $2 million in retirement savings. Do I want that in my own name, or do I want that in a pension account? I definitely want that in a pension account. I just never have to think about tax ever again. And obviously, if any dollar that I'm not paying in tax is another dollar that I get to spend. So,
and what Dallas is referring to as a pension account, just think of that. It's a superannuation fund.
It's a circle.
It's superannuation.
Yeah.
So the pension. The pension is an account-based pension, which is a superannuation 0% taxed fund.
Yep.
So it's effectively the tax difference. The tax difference is immense. And the way that I think of it also is that even when I'm working, let's say I have $100,000 of investment, and that earns me that investment earns me income, and that income is taxable in my own name. Now, I spoke before. Anyone that earns between $45,000 and $120,000 a year, which is a big group of people, their tax rate is effectively 34.5% on that band. So if I have a $100,000 investment and it's earning me, $5,000 of income, for example, then I get taxed at 34.5% on that income. It forms part of my tax assessable income. If I could snap my fingers tomorrow and have that $100,000 appear or move from my own name and be invested instead of in my own name and now into my superannuation fund, the tax rate drops to 15%. That's while I'm still working.
Yeah.
It's a big differential in the earnings tax rate. And remembering that's the place where I want that money to end up as well. So, So because we can then move it to 0% tax at some stage in the future when someone's retired.
So I think this is probably one of that, like you often say, like an SBS movie where the question started with, what about investments outside super? And then we've spent the last 7 minutes talking about why you should want your investments inside super. But I think that probably explains...
Well, there's many reasons why you might have investments outside of superannuation.
Yeah, and I think... So,
one is accessibility.
Well, so I think that's... I think there's a heap of different reasons why you might have investments outside of super. But if we look at there's a concept here that I don't think we've quite got to the nub of the issue here. Is I think there's something in people's minds where they go, super is the investment. Now, we've sort of glossed over it saying, different asset classes. But if you have money with Sun Super or MLC Super or any other super fund, it's not, that money is not invested. The super fund itself doesn't make the decision as to how that money is invested. You make that decision. And, we've touched on it in various other podcasts. But when people go, I've got money in super, that is true. They have it owned via a super fund, but how that money is invested is 100% their choice. You can choose how that money is invested. Yeah, most people don't, and it goes into a default investment option. But this is, I guess, the point is, I think there's a separation in people's minds where they go, I've got my super, but if I want to invest money, it has to be outside of super. So the first thing that I just want to clarify again is that is not only, yes, you might think about investments outside of super, but the primary focus of your retirement savings should be not just getting money into super, but how do I invest that money once I get it in there? What choices am I making about what asset classes that need to be invested in? So when we're then separating out investments outside super, it's then also investments inside super. So we do need to think of it that way. It's not just on my super fund and I just sort of ignore it and I get a statement once a year and I'll do all these cool things outside super. The primary focus needs to be get money into super and then get that money working as hard as possible. So now to get to your point there, Michael, of why, so some of the reasons why you might have investments outside super. The first one, as you say, accessibility. So obviously this podcast is called Money Over 50. So if you're in your 50s, 60s just around the corner, and you're normally focused on retirement, so accessibility is not as big of a concern for you. But for some people, if they think there might be something that's going to pop up in the next few years where they need access to that money. If you're 52 and you're putting every dollar you own into superannuation, it's great for your retirement, but if something comes up where you need that money in 3 years' time, you're stuck. You can't get it back out. So that's kind of what you're referring to there with that accessibility.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's that. If you've borrowed to invest, then you would generally not put that into superannuation.
So you basically you can't borrow effectively. And this is one of those things where it's like any financial planner who's listening goes, well, actually you can borrow through. Yes, you can borrow through super, but it's minimal and it's not as effective as borrowing to invest in your own name or in other entities generally. So
yeah. So accessibility is probably the biggest one, and your example I think was a good example. You're 52, you're setting yourself up for retirement, but you want the ability to be able to access those funds.
Yeah.
If you need them for whatever reason, you lose your job, for example. So there are certainly reasons that you would invest outside of superannuation.
Yeah.
Typically, I mean, you can invest in similar things inside super and outside of super. There's not the same.
No.
It's probably not the same level of assets that you can invest into inside of superannuation as you can outside of superannuation.
So I think because we're sort of talking about this in general terms, a good way to explain this might be like for yourself and myself. So we both have money inside superannuation, but we also have investments outside of superannuation. So if I think about the investments that I have outside of superannuation, for each of them, there's a reason why it's there and not inside. So I've got a mob of cows that I own with my father. So not really. I'm sure I could own them through a self-managed super fund, but gee, there'd be a lot of headaches, and it wouldn't have the same advantages of flexibility of being able to put money in, pull money out of our investment in a mob of cows. We own our office that we operate out of, and again. The reason why we've done that not through superannuation is because we could borrow a fair bit more at really cheap rates and use the borrowing power, which is what you touched on before, is that through super you couldn't really do that as effectively. So, and then the other main investment that I guess, the other couple of investments I've got outside of superannuation is my wife and I have got a little investment set up that was. And the reason that money exists there and why we add to that is basically to fund a house purchase in a few years' time. And so, again, the same thing there. Even though that asset would, from a tax point of view, be best off being owned through superannuation, it's not due to that accessibility factor. We can't put that money into super and then turn around in a few years' time and pull it back out and buy a house with it. So, I think that's probably a good example of. There's some cows there which are a completely different asset class. So you just really effectively can't get exposure to that asset class through superannuation. There's an asset class which is commercial property, which you can borrow a lot against outside of super where you can't inside. So there's basically some borrowing advantages there. And then there's the accessibility issue, which is the investment that we've got in our own names, which is just an index fund of Australian and overseas companies. Normally I would own that through super, but I do want to get access to that in a few years' time. And so that sort of hopefully gives people a bit of a concrete example of why, when you might potentially invest outside super. But I guess the exception proves the rule to me, where it's like, that's because I'm 31 and I'm looking at buying a house for a few years' time and I'm doing other different things like that. Anything that I'm just thinking about, I just want to put money away for my retirement for the long-term future, it just goes straight into superannuation and it just gets straight invested in the biggest and best companies in Australia and around the world.
Yeah, look, it's again, you're 31. I'm older than that. I'm 46. So and my wife's 38. So the way that we think about it, so we have investments, the ones that you mentioned, except for the cows. By the way, is it a mob? Is a mob of cows that? That's the technical, like a flock of seagulls,
like a murder of crows, or
it's a mob of cows.
I don't actually know what the technical. I think if you're American, it's a herd. If you're Australian, it's a mob.
A mob,
a mob of cows. Yeah.
It didn't sound exactly. I hear you say it all the time, and I thought. So I don't have the mob of cows, but I have the building with you, and I have a few other things as well. What we're gearing up to, though, over the next, what I'm gearing up for the next 14 years is that the day that I turn 60, I want to have as close to that $1.7 million of funds in my superannuation fund at that point in time.
Yep.
The day my wife turns 60, I want to have as close to that $1.7 million of funds in her superannuation fund as well. So, look, you can get the best of both worlds there by trickling money across. And we have a number of clients. I have clients that are in their very early 50s, and they have investment set up as well, and we're trickling funds across into their super fund every year, and getting the best of both worlds really by still retaining access to the money that they have that's invested, but gradually moving that across, and the closer they get to age 60, the more funds have been moved across into that.
And I think another example, I've got clients that business owner clients as well that they're actually getting closer to 60. They're contributing everything they're maxing out their concessional, their before tax contributions to super. They're maxing out their after tax contributions to super, and they still have some cash left over. So that money that they just can't get it in super. If we could click our fingers and get it all in now, we would, but they're just stuck, not able to get that money into super. We have to do that gradually. So I think there's sort of those two parts of it, like you say, where some of our clients, they could just put all that money into super, but in their early 50s, it's still a little way to go. They might not necessarily, they want to have access to that money if they need an emergency. And then there's other clients that, they don't necessarily want access to it, but they just can't get it into super. And that's I think, to me, where, as you say, and you touched on that with yourself and Susie, where you really want to be working backwards, is that. And as your financial planner and as the best financial planner in Australia, that's sort of how we're approaching it. Is there's no point going, okay, you're 46 now, we get to 60, and then go, oh, geez, this money would have been good to get that into super. Oh, geez, we could have that, tax-free earnings, tax-free income. Oh, that would have been good. You have to start planning now to get to that point, and that's kind of what you touched on. Is for a lot of people, it's sort of about that working backwards thing. It's going. That's where I want to end up in retirement. And as you touched on before, and I took that point around with it before, if we were punished along the way, if you got taxed more along the way to get into that holy grail of a 0% earnings tax, 0% income tax environment in 10 years' time, it would kind of make sense to go, are they going to change the rules? But you're getting into the environment where you want to end up, and the whole way along the way, for most people, there are tax savings in terms of making that. You can get a tax saving on the contribution in, then you can get a tax saving on the earnings while you're still working, to then get that money into the best and most tax effective ownership structure to own your retirement savings in. So to me, it's for those types of assets, for your retirement savings, and if you're investing in the asset classes that you can get exposure to through super, it doesn't make sense to not be taking full advantage of that.
Yeah, good point. And again, I think that's probably the wrap up position is start backwards.
Yep.
And remember the benefits of the legislation. And the legislation are that each individual can have up to $1.7 million of funds inside superannuation, that when they meet a conditional release after age 60, they can effectively turn that into a 0% taxed fund, a la an account-based pension. And look, if you're a member of a couple, that means you can have up to $3.4 million of funds effectively in a 0% taxed fund after age 60. So if you start working backwards and say, okay, well, that's where I want to end up, then how do I get there is probably the best approach to do that. And you may have investments outside of superannuation, and there's a benefit to having those, of course, for accessibility. But if you can start by saying, okay, that's where I want to end up in the future, which is in general for most people is the place that they would get the best value out of, then that's the right approach.
And I guess that's the other point is that for a lot of people, when they come to us for a first meeting, often people do have investments outside super, and one of the things that we haven't touched on is why. So I've got a new client coming in tomorrow actually for a meeting, and they've got their superannuation and they've got some shares that they own in their own name outside of super. Now, I'm going to recommend that they hang on to them for a few years, and there's once you're in that position, there's actually they would pay capital gains tax if they sold down that investment now and contributed into super, and they plan to retire in a couple of years' time anyway. So the plan for them will be hold those investments for 2 years and then sell them down once you retire and your taxable income's dropped. So it's and that's like you're saying, it's really just about planning backwards and going, okay, here's where you are now, here's all the available resources, here's what you've got inside super and outside super. How do we work all that as hard as possible and pay the least amount of tax now and throughout the rest of your working life, and then all through your retirement? And so it is a bit different for everyone depending on your situation, your plans over the long term, what types of investments you have, all those kinds of things. But hopefully that gives people a bit of an idea of how to think about their total retirement savings, both inside and outside super.
Thanks for your question, Leone. It was a really good one.
Yeah.
It had us thinking, of course, in terms of how we communicate that across to everyone. So we certainly welcome questions from listeners.
Absolutely.
Podcast at mo50.com.au.
That's
mo50.com.au is the place to...
Any feedback, any questions, any thoughts, let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Money Over 50 podcast with Money Over 50 financial advisors. We look forward to catching up again soon.